I'm here with Doctors Nicholas Baham and Dr. Nolan Higdon. They are the authors of a new book, The Podcaster's Dilemma, Decolonizing Podcasters in the Era of Surveillance Capitalism. Thank you all for coming on. People may be wondering why I have a couple academics who wrote about podcasting on. Well, I told Nolan before I was doing a deep search of Billy Procida. From time to time, I get very self-flagellating and like to just get to the page 6, page 7. Who's saying what about me this time? And I see something for Google Books. And I'm like, Google Books? I was like, what am I doing in a Google Books thing? And I see the description of the book where it talks about like anti-colonial. And I'm like, oh, fuck, that's probably about me. I'm the colonial part, aren't I? All right. But y'all included the Manwhore podcast as well as a bunch of other great podcasts in your book about podcasting. And I was like, I'll pay $40 for an ego boost. Let's see what they had to say. Yeah, which one of you found my show first? Which one of you might be in trouble with HR at the university for looking up horse shit in the office?
Well, Billy, it was probably, it might have been me. I also teach a course in Black sexualities where we challenge a lot of dominant cultural constructions around sexuality, heteronormativity, patriarchy, settler colonial monogamous marriage, things like that. So I think I found you first. And I think that the first podcast I ever listened to of yours, you were talking about masturbating and then coming on your girlfriend's rug. Yep. And how difficult like that was to clean up, etc. I loved your podcast for that kind of immediately for that kind of open discussion about masturbation, which ought not to be. By the way, May is Masturbation Month. I don't know if you know this, but you probably do, right? So let's celebrate today with that. But the
guys, that's the bonus episode. Actually, I don't know if I told you all what we were going to do next.
Right. So when I listened to your podcast, I went to Nolan and I listened to a lot of others, things like Horrible Decisions, for example, Food for Thought, or even Latina Hot Wife Adventures, stuff like that were challenging these dominant norms of sexuality. So I went to Nolan and I said, look, we're doing a podcast and we're trying to kind of decolonize dominant narratives. Look at all these other people who are doing that. For us, it was vaguely reminiscent of what was coming out of what revolutionary radio used to do, like in the fight to reclaim Algeria from the French, their voice of fighting Algeria. So it turns out there are some profound continuities with that. And while you might not place yourself in the same kind of lineage as something like the voice of fighting Algeria, that's kind of exactly how we see you in interrogating and critiquing and also providing counter narratives for dominant ideologies. You're really helping to free people in many ways.
I thought I was just a comedian with a fuck show oversharing.
Not at all.
That sounds so much more impressive to tell my father. So, thank you for that. Wow. I believe the words were, Procida helps deconstruct through sensationally entertaining commentary. I want that on my tombstone. I'm going to get that one. That one page is going to be framed on my wall. But wait, so what can you tell me more about that? Like how clearly I'm unaware of what it is I'm doing. What is it that I'm doing?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things we picked up on almost immediately was just the use of comedy. Comedy is a great tool to make difficult issues more digestible, and we saw a lot of that within the podcasting space.
But you're funny in a kind of interesting way. So we were contrasting you with things like dominant media, which and legacy media, which often takes itself very seriously and kind of markets that righteous indignation. Mm-hmm. There's very little self-effacement. For example, if you're listening to a Tucker Carlson who's telling us for some reason or the other what we need to do to be men. And by the way, Tucker Carlson, check yourself in the mirror. I'm not sure that you fully classify for that. But, you have this a lot of our decolonizing podcasters are very self-effacing. So they're experts, but they don't necessarily beat you over the head with how embedded they are in the community or how expert they are. They're willing to be wrong about issues. They're willing to risk their necks for very controversial types of things. And most importantly, as Nolan says, laugh at themselves. And that's what is drawing audiences to you, is that lack of kind of self-righteous indignation, if you will.
I didn't know, by the way, y'all weren't talking about masturbation too. I thought we were all talking about it. So
we're all
isn't
talking
that
about
silly?
it. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Yeah, well, it's one of the things we immediately found in the text, right? So we're looking at these podcasters who are dealing with these very serious issues, right, about sexual norms and racism and sexism and economic inequalities. These are really like important issues, and sometimes, yes, they are introduced with humor, but we think it's done in a really constructive way. So this book is really a celebration of podcasting culture in a lot of ways. As part of that story, we also said, we are concerned. We are, scholars of media. We've seen how in the past these media spaces have opened to talk about controversial issues and then been taken away. And one of the things we bring up in the text is, a lot of the places where folks are posting information, big tech controls what can and can't be posted and what users will and won't see. And this book is kind of also a warning, is saying like, look, we need to protect this space. There's a lot of incredible work going on here. There's a lot of, I think, hope for the future if podcasting continues to develop. And we don't want to see, big tech overlords or anybody else take that away.
Mm-hmm. Podcasting is blowing up year after year. We're seeing like the Edison research is saying like more and more people know what a podcast is. It's pretty much just like my grandparents don't know. They're like kind of the only ones left. It's like more people know what a podcast is. More people are listening to podcasts. More people are listening to podcasts for longer periods of time. What is so special about the medium of podcasting?
Well, in addition to content, Billy, and I'll let Nolan speak to some of this too, because he has a really interesting analogy with punk rock. One of the things we found is that you guys are not operating, those of you who can be called decolonizing podcasters, you are not operating on the same capitalist model as legacy media. You have absolutely...
That sounds like a really fancy way to say we make less money.
No, what it means is that you're willing to share the pot with other like-minded podcasters. You cross-promote. Mm-hmm. You put other people on your show in order to promote their podcasts. They put you on their show to promote your podcast. There isn't a sense of, look, I'm the big dog and I'm going to eat all the other little dogs in the market. There's a sense of we're in a community. Right. Mm-hmm. And we're going to share and we're going to help one another's voices get out. Nolan, you have a really good analogy for this to punk rock.
Yeah. Growing up in like the San Francisco Bay Area, what I saw in podcasting reminded me of what I saw growing up in like punk rock culture, where, you're sort of lame if you kind of only promote yourself. Like the real people in the community promote others. And so I see in some of these podcast shows, they're always referencing other podcast hosts, other podcast programs. They're having them on as guests. And you get the sense of a real like community that's just interesting, curious people who are doing great work versus like, these kind of like vapid, greedy competitors, which is what we saw in previous mediums, right? We see like cable news networks compete against each other, or if people are old enough to remember in like the 90s, like Howard Stern would try and compete with other like shock jocks to take over markets.
Yeah.
Podcasting is just totally different, man. It's much more like cooler, inviting environment.
There are listening hours for everybody. Like, you don't have to choose one or the other. You could even see that in like vertical corporate entertainment structures where it's like that cross promoting can happen, but like only within the network or within Viacom channels. So like, who you see on Colbert, probably more, those guests are more likely probably to be owned by CBS. I think that's Viacom. And, like they kind of keep it in the vertical. Whereas in with podcasters, we're good fits for each other's audiences. Let's share the pot. Yeah. Like you said, share the pot.
And that's one of the fears we have in the book is, we're saying like, let's keep it in this open environment. One of the things we don't want to happen is where, you can only get certain podcasts on like certain websites or certain outlets that house it. We don't want it to go in that same model that so much of corporate media has gone. We like kind of the open, accessible environment it currently is.
And they're trying to do that. They keep trying to do it. Luminary, the Spotify exclusive. But you know what? Aside from maybe the Spotify exclusive shows like these, which Spotify has its own thing already going on, these new platforms that are like, we'll be the Netflix for podcasting. But people are like, I'm not going to pay for that. You know? So like we're already seeing those attempts and they'll fucking shove hundreds of millions of dollars into it, but they're really starting to flop and fail. Luminary got like, you know, less than a percentage point of the overall market share, like probably at its peak. It's right. Wild, but like, so there's some sort of a audience resistance to that too. Like, it's like audiences don't seem to want to play into that either.
Well, audiences are hungry for the kind of content that you're providing, not just the humor that you provide, and you're quite funny, right? But there's insight in every one of your broadcasts. There's insight. There's normalization of things that are otherwise considered aberrant behavior, etc. I mean, you want another thing to put on your tombstone. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, when I first read Henry Miller, how he just normalized sex. It was like eating, right? It was just, okay, that's cool. So for me, you're also kind of a Henry Miller of the airwaves to some degree. People want that. That's not in legacy media anywhere. You can't talk about, you know, non-monogamy and masturbation and, you know, a trans desire or any of these kinds of things in legacy media. Yet that's the way most people are experiencing their lives, right? Mm-hmm. So they're going to you because you reflect and are a closer voice to the streets of the way that people are actually experiencing their lives. And that in and of itself is decolonizing, right? Yeah. You're not brainwashing anybody. You're saying, dude, this is like what you're seeing every day. Okay. Yeah. So let's just talk about that and put that front and center.
Can you define that term, decolonizing?
Yeah. So what we're talking about specifically are pushing back against European colonial norms. And so what we're talking about here are things like racism, sexism, gender binary, heteronormativity, frankly, neoliberalism, acceptance of the class structure, acceptance of predatory capitalism, things like that. Things that we often take for granted. They're most powerful because we take them for granted, right? Mm-hmm. Things are the way they are. We just accept that. Podcasts like yours are decolonizing because you call into question the very things, the very structures of power that we take for granted. So why do we accept a gender non-binary? There's a power construct behind that, right? I mean, whether that's in medical institutions and medical journals and medical research or in universities, or drug companies, right? There's a power construct behind that. When you critique that, you're shaking that shit up. Mm-hmm. And that's what we mean by decolonizing.
And correct me if I'm talking out my ass, if this isn't it, but do people does audience get trapped into that structure in feeling like we're not supposed to talk about these things? But hey, Billy's doing it in that. I have an interesting issue where I find that it's hard for my listeners will tell me privately, they will tell friends privately about the show. But unlike other podcasts they listen to, they will not share my show on social media because they don't want to be associated with sluttiness, non-monogamy, kink, what have you. Even though sharing a show doesn't say you're doing a thing, it means you're just interested in hearing about it. But also, if you were doing it, who gives a fuck? So is what you described trapping an audience also?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of shaming behind, transgressing dominant norms. And that's really what you're referring to here. You're transgressing those dominant norms. There are people who enjoy it, but they enjoy it privately because they know that going out into the corporate world and sort of blasting the Manwhore podcast in your cubicle still will incite some degree of shame. At the same time, though, if you were to actually do that, and I do that in my classes, I've shared your podcast in my classes. But if you were to do that in the public sphere, you also break a lot of shit up, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you really challenge things.
Well, if I can jump in on that point, I mean, I think that's a really point we should repeat, because so much of the media in this country, it's a really narrow, it's like 6 to 9 corporations control the majority of media that people interact with. they give a real distorted view of the world. They would never draw attention to the topics in which you're talking about. And that's why, folks like yourself and these other podcasters we profiled are seen as such a threat to them. So they've launched this, war on quote unquote new media, and they've asked for shadow banning and demonetization and Google to alter its search engine and all these things under the auspices of fighting misinformation. But really what they're trying to do is suppress their competition, because you guys all stand in direct contradiction to what they've claimed for years, right? They've claimed that audiences, are too stupid to deal with complex issues. They like short sound bites. They like high broadcast quality. And then here's these ragtag podcasters from like their living room, discussing like a sexual act for like 3 hours and drawing like audience's attention engagement to levels that corporate media can only dream of. And so I think for those reasons, that's why you see this pushback. You guys actually are a threat to kind of the established order collectively.
Yeah, we can't let him get a hand job on microphone. What? This must be stopped.
Right. And,
exactly.
And arguably some of the greatest moments in broadcast history. And I would say to you, too, that there are, even though you may not think that this is happening, I believe that there are like profound social justice implications of the work you do. Mm-hmm. So let's take, for example, acceptance of trans desire or trans identity, right? Coming through your broadcast. There are real issues in America right now around the murder of trans people. So for you to normalize trans lives, trans desire, and step outside of the gender non-binary with your critique, with your comedy, with your guests, that has some real profound implications in a world where people are really getting hurt and killed by dominant ideologies and people who are going around, committing hate crimes in the name of supporting those dominant ideologies.
Yeah. And they don't have to be stuck in them either. Look, I've been doing the show 8 years. I started when I was 24. I'm about to be 33 soon. So it's like, I'm also documenting some change on these things. I remember, if you listen to the first year of the podcast, you will hear like my real hot take on the concept of transgender, and like it is in a very different place now. And that's not just to say like, oh look, I changed, but more like, hey y'all, it's okay if you don't get it now. You're allowed to learn and progress on it. Right. Which kind of leads into, I think, the last question I had, which was, gender and sexuality is a section that is primarily filled with a lot of minority voices and minority populations, right? Like whether it's women or racial minorities or trans people or different genders and sexual orientations, kink subcultures. And yet I'm not, look at my face. I'm like none of these things. Is there a problem with someone like me tackling such heavy issues, and especially when like I'm not, how do I rephrase this? What are the implications of someone like me, quote unquote, leading conversations like this about these topics, not being necessarily part of these communities?
So, I mean, the thing is that we're not talking about skin color here. Mm-hmm. We're talking about whiteness as a construct of power. The degree to which you critique actually not only race, but you critique white masculinity as it has been structured, as a colonial construct, right? Patriarchal, associated with violence, et cetera, and rape, frankly. The degree to which you've dismantled that marks a degree to which you've dismantled whiteness. Because you've been willing to dismantle aspects of whiteness and power, that allows you to open up a conversation with a lot of different folk. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. You're willing to open up the conversation. The truth of the matter is that America could use more European American folk like you, who are willing and able to just throw themselves wholeheartedly into dismantling key aspects of whiteness. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. The idea of like, when I, if we keep in the topic of race, when they say, well, yeah, we're all yelling and screaming, but we would like you white people to yell and scream about this too.
Yeah.
They actually might even have more weight when they see of their own saying why you say that.
That's right.
Yeah. I think there's been, I don't know, there's particularly a dangerous version of like identitarian politics where we now sort of say some groups can talk about some things and other groups can't. And I think if we want to live in a democracy, that's frankly asinine. We all need to be able to communicate about all issues all the time in a responsible and constructive way. And we need to engage each other in difficult conversations. And if that necessitates using comedy or developing podcast communities, like, so be it. But this idea that we should sort of check ourselves and engage in any topics because of a narrow identity, I think is toxic for democracy.
Absolutely. Fellas, is there, aside obviously from like getting the book, which I think people should do, if anything, to check out I think it's roughly 4 or 5 pages I'm on. Besides getting the book, is there anything in particular you think is really important listeners hear from you about the medium of podcasting?
Well, we're concerned about the dilemma, right, Nolan?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, I one of the big takeaways I hope from this text is that folks will rethink, if they haven't already, about just the value of this space and what it means to protect it. And, we hear a lot of proposals about, we need to get rid of these voices, these hate mongers or these fake news producers. And oftentimes, I agree the world would be better without those things. However, usually when you empower institutions, particularly industry and government, to start removing content, it starts to bleed into other areas. And so it may start with the Alex Jones of the world, for example, but it very quickly becomes like the left-wing activists who are, challenging norms and sexual norms and things like that. So
what do you think about banning not them from like the medium of podcasting, but when Spotify says we don't want to have this on here, no one's stopping anyone from having an RSS feed. Right. Certain platforms just might say, I don't want you on ours. But do you think that's like a fair in between?
I was just going to say, it becomes a slippery slope because we know like Google and social media companies are actively, under pressure from government to remove certain content. So if Google privileges Spotify at the top of people's searches for podcasts, then you've essentially buried those other podcasts that can't appear on Spotify. And that's where we're kind of worried about this space becoming, where unless you're savvy enough to find a podcast you already know exists, a lot of these folks who are doing great work are going to get buried in big tech's algorithms.
Mm-hmm. Nick, it looked like you had something to say.
Well, we do recommend in the book several things. One, the breakup of big tech, so that, like if you got a company like Spotify that decides that it's going to censor according to certain lines, it's not the dominant voice in the market, right? Mm-hmm. The dominant content provider in the market. That's the real problem, is the kind of potential monopolization of that space. The other thing is that we do advocate for something like Canada's law around privacy, where individuals themselves can choose what data can be publicly shared. And they can edit that as well. So we're also concerned with people who listen to the Manwhore podcast who are then being identified through surveillance capitalism as listeners of the Manwhore podcast and have specific things marketed to them that they may or may not want to engage with. Because consider, Billy, that might discourage a lot of people from actively listening to the podcast.
I feel like a few people just hit unsubscribe as you said.
No, but I think we solved that problem with things like the Canadian law or the European law, which we don't have anything like this in the United States that would allow consumers to actually look at their data that's online and say, okay, I don't want to share that. It's also about nudging you in particular directions too. And that's another danger of surveillance capitalism. They have enough data on you that you've given up voluntarily that they can kind of push you politically. And we see that this is a really big game in the political sphere now.
And so then, to leave people with a call to action, so to speak, what are things an individual can do to support these decolonizing podcasters? Oh gosh, I'm going to just get a bracelet with that. What can individual listeners do to support those shows and to protect their favorite indie shows? And by indie, I mean they're not part of NPR or something, WNYC or something like that. What can people do? What can people listening right now do to support the shows they love?
Well, I think, I think at some level, people are already doing it in like a very kind of fascinating way. You know, people are increasingly turning off legacy media and going to these new media outlets. So continuing to do that and supporting folks with money, if you can, of course, or drawing attention to them by sharing them with your friends and such. Politically, I think people should push themselves to be more savvy as well and resist this kind of knee-jerk urge to remove content online. And also, you know, support politicians who are really talking about breaking up big tech in a way. And even more at an individual level, folks can also look at like encryption, you know, trying to like hide your communications and develop some privacy in this surveillance capitalist world to any level they can.
And again, Billy, you know, look, hit subscribe for the Manwhore podcast. Support the Manwhore podcast. If this is what you want to listen to, continue to be a part of the community. And at the same time, as Nolan says, advocate for the breakup of big tech and for laws that protect our privacy. There is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't have these things. And frankly, if we made our votes dependent upon, you know, our privacy in the digital space, we get some action on this.
Well, guys, I can't wait to read the whole book. Like I said, I've only read four pages. There, some of them are disconnected, but I look forward to reading the whole thing. And thank you again for making time to come on. Where can people go to follow y'all to your work? And obviously, I'll have a link in the show notes for the Podcaster's Dilemma.
Oh, you can find our work at projectcensor.org. Nick and I are both associated with them, and follow us on Twitter. I'm at Nolan_Higdon, and Nick is at Dr. Dreadlocks.
We also had a podcast called Along the Line, which we may be reviving in the near future. We just sort of took a hiatus to write this book.
Super cool. I can't wait to hear about you coming on a rug.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm on a rug right now, Billy, and it is masturbation month.
Be brave, Nick. Be brave. You guys were super fun to chat with. I would love to have y'all back if anything else big happens in the podcasting world that you think people need to know about, or if you just want to like continue throwing really like lofty academic compliments at me, you're welcome back anytime.
We got you, Billy. We got your back. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thanks again, fellas. And why don't you go ahead and say goodbye to everybody?
Take care, podcast universe.
Absolutely. Manwhore Universe, thank you for having us.